They were already folding chairs and unplugging microphones when it happened. That's right, it was the moment when a little girl, no taller than the podium, walked up to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, clutching a worn Bible with both hands, and asked a question that silenced everyone in the room. Not about policies, not about party lines. She asked, "What does God mean to you?" And what followed wasn't just an answer, it was a confession, a reckoning, and a moment so raw, it left grown men wiping their eyes in public. If you've ever wondered what faith looks like after a lifetime of storms, this story will stay with you. Comment where you're watching from, hit like if you still believe faith belongs in public life, and subscribe if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard. East Dallas wasn't the kind of place where miracles made headlines. The church gymnasium doubled as a voting site, a soup kitchen, and sometimes, on slow weekends, a town hall space with mismatched folding chairs and a faint echo from the concrete floors. That Sunday evening had all the marks of an ordinary wrap-up. Plastic water bottles half drunk on tables, campaign flyers slumped on the floor like forgotten promises, volunteers joking quietly while packing away clipboards. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had already loosened her shoes behind the curtain. It had been a long day of answering questions about infrastructure bills, school zoning, and local labor disputes. Her assistant mouthed, "Let's go," from across the room while holding her coat. But then she saw her, a child, alone, not lost, just anchored. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, standing still in the middle of it all with a faded children's Bible in both hands, not a new one either. The spine was cracked, and the edges curled like the corners of an old photograph. She wore a pale yellow dress, with red barrettes at the ends of her braids, one slightly crooked, like someone had tried their best and hoped it was enough. No adult near her, no name tag, no camera, just quiet, sturdy intent. She walked toward Jasmine, not shyly, not boldly, but like someone who had been waiting for the right moment and knew this was it. Jasmine turned back around, one hand still gripping her phone, her mind half in logistics, half in exhaustion. But something about that child, something about the way she was holding that Bible, cut through every other noise. Jasmine blinked once, then twice. The child didn't flinch. She stepped forward, stood right in front of the Congresswoman, and asked, in a voice that was soft but unshakable, "Miss Jasmine, what does God mean to you?" For a moment, it felt like the oxygen had been pulled out of the room, like the lighting dimmed just slightly. Not in a theatrical way, just in that human way, when something real pierces through the performance. Every nearby conversation faded. The rattle of folding chairs stopped. Even the clinking of keys in a volunteer's pocket went quiet. Jasmine had answered 1,000 questions that day, some hostile, some rambling, some hopeful. But this one? This one came with no agenda, no cameras, no journalists ready to twist a quote. It was not political, and that's exactly why it undid her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her chest tightened. She glanced down at the girl's hands, gripping the Bible like a shield, or maybe like a lantern. Something stirred deep in Jasmine's memory, something dusty and long buried. She bent down slowly, not with the usual grace of a politician posing for a photo, but with the quiet collapse of someone who knows they are not the same person they were 5 minutes ago. Her knees touched the floor, cold and unyielding. And suddenly, she wasn't in a church gymnasium anymore. She was 9 years old, back in her mama's kitchen in Monroe, Louisiana, watching her mother cook, cry, and pray, all in the same breath. The scent of fried bologna and bleach seemed to return to her nostrils like ghosts rising through time. Jasmine swallowed hard. "What's your name, baby?" she asked, her voice gentler than it had been all day. "Alora," the girl replied, her eyes wide but calm. "My grandma said I could ask you anything." Jasmine smiled a little, caught off guard by the courage in that tiny voice. "And you picked the biggest question of all." Alora nodded. "That's why I saved it for last." There it was again, that wisdom children sometimes carry, that quiet depth that adults spend decades trying to reclaim. Alora wasn't just asking out of curiosity, she was asking out of need, and Jasmine had no script for that. She tried to speak again. Still nothing. Her throat felt like it was wrapped in vines. So instead, she reached out and touched the edge of the girl's Bible, her fingers resting lightly on its worn leather. "When I was your age," she began, her voice trembling, "I used to think God was supposed to fix everything. If you prayed hard enough, loud enough, fast enough, he'd show up and make life better." A pause. Alora didn't blink. She just listened, really listened, the way only children and the broken-hearted know how. "I remember," Jasmine continued, "sitting on the edge of my bed at night, hands clenched together so tight they ached, just praying that my mama would stop crying after work, that maybe the lights wouldn't get cut off again, that the shoes I wore to school wouldn't squeak when I walked through the hallway." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "But sometimes you do all of that and the lights still go off." Now people around the room were listening, really listening. The kind of listening that happens when truth walks into the room unannounced and uninvited, but sits down anyway. "I started wondering," Jasmine whispered, "maybe he didn't hear me, or maybe I just wasn't one of the ones he watched." That line landed like a thunderclap. One man who had been headed for the exit stopped in his tracks. A volunteer dropped the stack of papers she was carrying, and in that stillness, Jasmine finally let herself feel the heat rising behind her eyes. But Alora, tiny and still, asked the question that burned hotter than all the rest. "But you still believe, don't you?" And that was the line that cracked the dam wide open. Jasmine closed her eyes. One tear escaped, just one, and she didn't wipe it away. She let it sit there, let it be seen. Then she nodded slowly. "I do," she said, "but not in the way I used to. God isn't some magic switch you flip when you want things to get better. He's the thing that helps you get back up when they don't." Alora took her hand, small fingers slipping into Jasmine's palm like they'd always belonged there. And just like that, a moment that was supposed to be background noise on a sleepy Sunday night became the only thing anyone would remember. Jasmine sat alone that night, long after the town hall had emptied out, in the back seat of her car with the door slightly ajar, letting in the low hum of the East Dallas evening. The street lamps buzzed overhead, casting broken shadows across the windshield. Her assistant had offered to drive her home, but she'd waved them off. She needed space. She needed silence. Not the sterile silence of a congressional hearing room or the political kind that comes from knowing cameras are off, but the kind that lets you finally hear what your heart's been whispering under the noise. She hadn't been ready for Alora's question. Not really. People expected you to be ready all the time when you were in office, especially if you were black, a woman, and unapologetically honest. They expected you to have every policy detail memorized, every comeback rehearsed, but no one expected your soul to bleed in public. And yet, that's exactly what had happened. Because the truth, the kind that made her chest ache and her hands tremble, was that Jasmine's relationship with God hadn't always been made of soft hymns and Sunday peace. It was made of fire, of longing, of betrayal, of silence. She leaned her head back against the seat, eyes closed, and in that darkness, memories returned, not as flashbacks, but as sensations. The roughness of her mother's hands after a double shift, the smell of vinegar from the mop bucket on Sunday nights, the heat of shame when she had to wear shoes 2 sizes too small because they were all she had. Back then, in that small house in Monroe, Louisiana, faith wasn't framed on the wall. It was tucked under her mother's mattress inside a shoebox with tithing envelopes, old church bulletins, and a tiny New Testament with a cracked spine. Her mama prayed like breathing, quiet, constant, urgent, not for miracles, just for strength, just to make it one more day without losing her mind. Jasmine remembered watching her from the hallway, the way she'd sit on the edge of the bed with the lights off, just a candle flickering beside her, and her voice low, rhythmic. She used to think her mother's prayers were magic, that God must love her mama more than anyone else, because even when life stayed hard, her mother never stopped praying. But children see what they want to see. Jasmine didn't understand then that her mama's faith was stitched together with pain, that it took everything she had just to keep going, to keep believing that someone, anyone, was listening. She was 6 the first time she asked, "Mama, why do you pray so long if God don't change nothing?" Her mother had looked up, eyes red-rimmed but steady, and said, "Because sometimes, baby, it's the only thing I got left to do." That answer sat in her like a stone. As Jasmine got older, that stone turned to weight. She started noticing the contradictions, how the most faithful people she knew were often the ones struggling the hardest, how the loudest shouts of hallelujah came from pews filled with grief and brokenness. She watched Miss Tilda, who led Sunday school and kept peppermint in her purse for the kids, get evicted without warning after her landlord raised the rent. She watched her classmate's dad, a man who knelt every morning outside his pickup truck, get laid off after 22 years on the job. And then came Decene. Decene had been her cousin, her protector, her biggest believer. He was the first person who ever looked at her and said, "You got something special, Jazz. Don't let this town box you in." He was the one who walked her home when the boys at the corner store stared too long, the one who snuck her extra notebooks for debate club when their family couldn't afford them, the one who gave her a tiny lapel pin shaped like a gavel and said, "You're going to need this in court one day." She kept it in her top drawer for years, and then one morning, he just didn't come home. They found his body 2 days later behind a gas station, shot twice. Wrong place, wrong time. That's what the paper said. No arrests, no answers, no justice. Just a family ripped wide open. At the funeral, the pastor stood at the pulpit and said, "He's in a better place." Jasmine wanted to scream. She sat there with her fists clenched, her jaw tight, and thought, what kind of God takes the good ones and leaves the world full of people who don't care about nothing? That night, she tried to pray. Just one line, just one word. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. It wasn't anger, it was emptiness. Like every part of her that had once believed something sacred was watching had gone dark. From that moment on, she kept her head down. She studied harder. She applied to every scholarship she could find. She got into college, got out of Monroe, built a life. But she didn't take her faith with her. She left it in that shoebox, under her mama's bed, buried under years of questions that never found answers. She didn't return to prayer during college. She didn't return when she graduated. She didn't return when she passed the bar and started her first job as a public defender. Even when she stood in courtrooms defending women who looked like her mother with stories that mirrored her own, she still didn't turn back to God. Because she was surviving on grit, on fire, on the determination to never let the world silence her again. But grit, she would learn, has its limits. One night, about 2 years into her legal career, she got a call from her mama's boss. Bernadine had collapsed at work. Exhaustion, they said, blood pressure through the roof. Jasmine flew home that night on the cheapest ticket she could find, gripping the armrest of the plane so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she walked into the hospital room, her mother looked smaller somehow, frailer, the IV line in her arm like a thread holding her together. Jasmine tried to stay strong, but her voice cracked when she said, "Mama, I told you not to push so hard." Her mother smiled, weary but proud. "Baby, you wouldn't be where you are if I hadn't." Jasmine sat beside her the whole night, didn't sleep, just stared at the monitor beeping steadily, and for the first time in years, she whispered something under her breath. It wasn't a prayer, not exactly, just a plea. "Please don't take her from me." She didn't know who she was talking to. She just knew she needed someone, something, to hear her. The next morning, a nurse walked in and handed Jasmine a tray with breakfast. On top of the tray was a folded piece of paper, a Bible verse, handwritten and creased with age, Isaiah 41:10. "Fear not, for I am with you." Jasmine stared at it like it was burning. It wasn't an answer, but it was something. And sometimes, when your world is unraveling, something is the only thing you can hold on to. Back in her car, that memory still played on loop. The girl's voice, her mama's hands, Decene's laugh, the silence after prayer. And now, that moment at the town hall. A child asking a question that pulled every wound to the surface, and the audience watching, not as voters, but as people who had carried their own broken pieces into the room, hoping someone, someday, might name them out loud. Jasmine had named them, not because she meant to, not because she planned it, but because when Alora looked up at her and asked what God meant, she realized she still didn't fully know, but she also realized something even deeper, that the question was still alive inside her. That maybe the fact that she hadn't stopped asking meant she hadn't stopped believing. Faith wasn't gone. It was just wounded, tired, quiet, like a house with the lights off, but the front porch still warm. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small drawing Alora had given her before leaving, a stick figure of a woman with a microphone, a big yellow sun overhead, and the words, "Keep going." Jasmine held it in her lap, her thumb tracing the edge of the paper like a rosary. She didn't cry, not yet, but her chest ached with the weight of every prayer she'd ever choked back. She started the car, drove home in silence, and that night, for the first time in over a decade, she opened the old Bible she had carried through law school, but never dared to open. The one her mother had packed into her luggage without a word. The one with the margin notes from Sunday sermons and a pressed rose tucked between the Psalms. She didn't read a full chapter, just one line. And then, slowly, almost shakily, she whispered, "Help me." Not because she believed everything was about to get easier, but because, for the first time in years, she wasn't pretending she could carry all of it alone. The morning after the town hall, Jasmine Crockett didn't speak a word to anyone. Her phone buzzed nonstop with missed calls from her staff, local reporters, constituents. Some wanted statements, others wanted spin, and a few, too many, wanted to exploit the moment. "A vulnerable Crockett shows her soft side," one headline read. "Unexpected Bible moment goes viral," another claimed. But Jasmine didn't read them. She left her phone face down on the kitchen counter, next to a half-drunk mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. She sat at her kitchen table in a t-shirt from law school, her elbows on her knees, the worn Bible lying unopened in her lap like a challenge she wasn't sure she was ready to face again. It wasn't the public's reaction that rattled her. She had lived too long in the political arena to be surprised by clicks and commentary. What shook her was the way the moment hadn't left her. She kept hearing the child's voice, that soft but piercing question, echoing in her mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. "What does God mean to you?" She had answered from the heart, without a script, without a guard, and now that rawness lingered, not as regret, but as exposure. Something had opened, something she hadn't touched in years. The memory of the crowd's silence, the old man standing in the back with misted eyes, the woman clutching tissues on the second row, all of it kept coming back like pieces of a dream she couldn't unsee. But the thing that stayed with her most was the weight of that little girl's hand in hers. It wasn't just a moment of connection. It was a tether, a reminder that no matter how far she'd run from her past, some truths had a way of finding you again. Through the hands of a child, through a cracked Bible, through a question so deceptively simple it shattered you from the inside out. Jasmine tried to return to routine. She met with staff, reviewed legislation, signed constituent letters. But she moved like someone sleepwalking. The words she read blurred. The calls she took felt distant. Her staff noticed, of course, but said nothing. They had seen her burned out before. What they hadn't seen was her this quiet, not angry, not defiant, just quiet. 3 days after the town hall, Jasmine ducked into a small cafe near Elm Street for a late lunch. She wore a hoodie and glasses, hoping not to be noticed, hoping to sit in a booth by the window and just breathe for a moment. She ordered iced tea, skipped the food. She opened her laptop to finish some budget memos, but ended up just staring at the screen. The world outside moved, cars passing, people laughing. But inside, it felt like everything was standing still. A waitress approached with her drink, paused, and asked quietly, "Excuse me, are you Representative Crockett?" Jasmine looked up, startled but composed. She nodded. "My grandfather was at that town hall," the woman said. "He hasn't talked about faith in over 20 years. That night he called me crying, said, 'You reminded him what it felt like to believe in something again.'" Jasmine blinked, lips parted. "He keeps talking about that little girl," the waitress added. "Says he sees her in his dreams. Says she asked the question he's been too afraid to ask himself." Jasmine didn't respond. She couldn't. Not because she didn't want to, but because her throat locked. The waitress gently placed the tea on the table, gave a quiet nod, and walked away. Jasmine exhaled, closed her laptop, She picked up her phone, not to check messages, but to scroll to the photo she'd taken that night after everyone had left. The church lights dimmed, the chairs stacked, and on the podium, left behind like a gift, was Alora's drawing. "Keep going," it said, with the sun drawn in thick yellow crayon, rays stretching toward the margins like they refused to be contained. She looked at it now, zoomed in. Her hand trembled. She set the phone down. That's when she knew. She hadn't cried since that night. Not fully, not really. And the weight of that ache was beginning to press down. Later that evening, Jasmine sat on her balcony as the sun sank behind the Dallas skyline. The sky flared orange, then bruised purple, then faded into indigo. The city buzzed below, but up here it was calm. She sipped from a glass of water and clutched her mother's Bible. She hadn't opened it since that night, not because she didn't want to, but because she feared what she'd find, or what she wouldn't. The prayers that once flowed freely now came stuttered, uncertain, like trying to speak a language you hadn't used in years. She remembered being 17, laying on her bed after Dazine's funeral, staring at the ceiling, hands clenched into the blanket, trying to pray but feeling like the words dissolved before they left her lips. That night, the silence was unbearable. She had thought back then that silence meant absence, that God had turned his face away, that maybe her voice was too small to be heard. But now, older, more battered, more weathered, she wasn't sure if silence was absence or something else entirely. Maybe it was waiting, maybe it was listening, or maybe it was an invitation, not to explain the pain, but to sit with it, to allow it to breathe, to give it space without dressing it up in verses or pretending it was all part of some grand lesson. That thought terrified her, but it also made her feel, for the first time in years, less alone. She opened the Bible slowly, the pages soft from age. It fell open to a bookmarked verse, Psalm 34, verse 18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." She didn't read it twice. She just stared at the words, unsure if she believed them, but knowing, somehow, they were exactly the words she needed to see. Not because they fixed anything, but because they acknowledged the crack. She didn't cry, not yet, but she felt the sting in her chest, like tears were standing just beyond the door, waiting to be let in. 2 days later, Jasmine returned to the community center where the town hall had taken place. No press, no announcement, just her, alone. She asked the janitor if she could sit inside for a moment. He recognized her, opened the doors without hesitation. The chairs had been stacked, the floor swept clean. The room looked different now, but the space where she had knelt beside Alora felt unchanged. She walked slowly to that spot, stood there for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't done in over a decade. She knelt, no cameras, no speeches, just her knees against tile, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes closed. She didn't try to say a full prayer, just one sentence. "God, if you're there, I'm listening." No thunder, no voice from heaven, just the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. But the stillness, it felt different. It felt like surrender, not of hope, but of the need to always know. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not loudly, not quickly, but gently, like a breeze through a closed room. She breathed in. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was talking to herself. That night, back at her apartment, she wrote a note to Alora. She hadn't planned on it. It just happened. A simple thank you for asking what no one else had, for seeing her, not as a politician, but as a person, for reminding her that the questions matter more than the answers. She folded the note carefully, attached it to the drawing Alora had given her, and placed it in an envelope. She didn't know where to send it yet, but she knew it needed to exist. The next day, she brought the Bible to work, not as a statement, just as a presence. She kept it in her desk drawer, quiet, close. During lunch, she opened it again, just one verse, Isaiah again. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew she wanted to keep reading, and that was something. The prayer hadn't come in full, but something else had, a beginning. 4 days after the town hall, Jasmine Crockett stepped into the State House chamber with the kind of presence she had spent years mastering. Shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, eyes focused. But today, it wasn't armor. It wasn't for show. It was quiet steadiness. The kind that comes not from pretending you've got it all together, but from surviving the kind of silence that once nearly swallowed you whole. Her staff noticed the difference, not in her tone. It was still composed. Not in her language. It was still sharp, measured, deliberate. But in the pauses, the stillness between sentences, the way she listened more closely, looked people in the eyes longer, as if she was searching for something deeper in every conversation. The press had moved on quickly from the Bible moment. The news cycle had churned forward, latching onto the latest scandal, the latest tweet, the latest battle between parties. But for the people in that church gymnasium, it hadn't faded. In the days that followed, Jasmine received hundreds of messages, not about legislation, but about life. Emails from single mothers, handwritten letters from veterans, voicemails from grandmothers who hadn't been to church in years. They all shared one thing. Someone in their life, maybe even themselves, had once asked the same question Alora did, and never got a real answer. Jasmine didn't reply to all of them. She couldn't. But she read everyone. And in the margins of those stories, she found pieces of herself. People who had tried to pray but didn't know how anymore. People who had believed once, then buried that belief under layers of hurt and disappointment. People who, like her, had been holding their breath for years, waiting for permission to exhale. And in reading those words, Jasmine began to feel something like a return, not to who she was, but to who she might be becoming. The turning point came unexpectedly, as it often does, in a place that seemed far too ordinary to carry holy weight. It was a community forum in South Oak Cliff, a smaller crowd, mostly women, mostly older. It wasn't supposed to be emotional. It was about housing reform, zoning maps, rent stabilization, property tax incentives. Jasmine had given this talk a dozen times before. She knew the rhythm. She could do it in her sleep. But halfway through, during the Q&A, an older woman stood up, gray hair pulled into a bun, a floral blouse buttoned to the collar. Her voice shook slightly as she adjusted the microphone. My granddaughter wanted to come tonight. She's 10. She had a question, but she's shy, so she wrote it down. I told her I'd read it. Ed. Jasmine nodded gently. Of course. The woman unfolded a pink slip of notebook paper and held it up to the light. She cleared her throat. She wrote, Do you think God listens when I cry? The room fell silent, not in shock, but in stillness. That deep, breath-held quiet that only truth can pull from a room full of strangers. Jasmine stood there, motionless. Her prepared talking points faded from memory. Her pulse slowed, and for a second, it felt like she was back in the town hall again, with Alora's hand in hers, the air thick with grace. She didn't hesitate this time. She stepped out from behind the podium and walked slowly toward the woman. May I? She asked softly. The woman nodded and handed her the note. Jasmine looked at the paper, then turned to the audience, not as a politician, not even as a public servant, but simply as someone who had once asked the same thing. She lowered herself to one knee, held the paper in both hands, and said, I think God listens even when we don't know what to say. She looked up at the woman. Please tell your granddaughter that the crying doesn't mean he's not there. Sometimes it means he's closer than ever. Someone in the back gasped quietly. A few sniffles spread through the rows. The older woman put her hand to her mouth, whispering, Thank you. Jasmine nodded, stood, and returned to the microphone, but she didn't pick up where she left off. Instead, she took a breath and said, I know this isn't what we're here to talk about, but I want to say something I couldn't say before, because I hadn't found the words. She paused, eyes sweeping across the crowd. When that little girl asked me what God meant to me last week, I told her the truth, that I used to think he was supposed to fix everything, but I've learned. Sometimes he doesn't fix it, he walks you through it. A murmur of agreement. And that doesn't always feel like enough, but sometimes it's the only thing that keeps you breathing. She took a slow breath. I stopped praying for a long time, not because I didn't believe, but because I didn't know how to talk to someone I felt had let me down. Several heads nodded in quiet recognition. But someone reminded me recently that God isn't always the thunder. Sometimes he's the whisper that helps you wake up and face another day. The applause started soft. Just a few hands. But then it grew, full, rich, emotional. Not political applause, human applause. And Jasmine stood in it, not with pride, not with performance, but with quiet reverence. Afterward, as people lined up to speak with her, Jasmine felt something new in the way they approached. It wasn't awe. It wasn't expectation. It was connection. They weren't looking for a leader who had all the answers. They were looking for someone who knew how to sit in the questions. A man near the end of the line took her hand and said, "My wife died last year. I didn't think I'd ever go back to church, but I think maybe I will now, just to sit in the silence again." Jasmine pressed his hand with both of hers. "That's where I started too," she whispered. Later that night, in her apartment, Jasmine sat on the floor with her shoes off, the Bible beside her again. She didn't read it right away. She didn't open a devotional or light a candle. She just sat. And then, almost without realizing it, she whispered aloud, "Thank you." She didn't know what she was thanking him for. Maybe for the question, maybe for the girl, maybe for the way that tiny crack in her heart had let the light in again. And with that, she breathed, a deep, clean breath that reached all the way to her bones. The voice she'd thought she'd lost, her prayer voice, her inner voice, her voice of faith, it hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting for her to stop performing, to stop running, to stop pretending. It had been waiting for her to kneel in silence and finally say, "I'm here." The voice was back, not loud, not triumphant, but steady. And for the first time in a very long time, she listened. By the following week, something had changed, not in the headlines, not in her polls, not even in the way the press tried to box her into sound bites. What changed was deeper, quieter, and far more real. Jasmine Crockett began carrying a notebook again, not for policy points or debate notes, but for questions, not from constituents, from herself. She wrote them down at night, curled on the edge of her couch with the windows cracked open and the hum of Dallas beyond her walls. What am I afraid to admit still hurts? When did I stop expecting God to answer? Would I still kneel if no one was watching? She didn't write answers, just questions. She didn't try to fix them, just to honor them. And then something unexpected happened. Another town hall, this time outside of her district, a bipartisan invitation to speak about resilience in public service. She almost declined. The travel, the pressure, the discomfort of facing faith in unfamiliar spaces. But something inside her nudged, the same quiet whisper she had begun to recognize, not thunder, not fire, just a tug at her ribs. She arrived in the small town of Livingston late in the day. The meeting space was old but clean. American flags flanked the podium, and folding chairs were filled with farmers, teachers, veterans, and small business owners. Not all were supporters. Some didn't even know her by name. But there was a warmth in the room, the kind that doesn't come from shared politics, but from shared living. The talk began as expected, questions about education, inflation, the border. She answered clearly, calmly. She didn't dodge. She didn't preach. But then, just as she signaled to wrap up, a man in the front row stood. Sturdy build, worn hands, a baseball cap crumpled between his fingers. "Ma'am, I'm not here for politics," he said. "I watched that video, the one with the girl and the Bible, and I ain't set foot in a church since my boy died 3 years ago. But I keep thinking about what you said, about God not fixing everything, but helping us stand up anyway. I wanted to say thank you and ask, how do you know he's still there when everything in you wants to quit?" The room went still. Jasmine didn't rush to answer. She stepped away from the podium again, like she had with Alora, like she had with the girl's grandmother, like she had with the paper note from the 10-year-old who wanted to know if God listened to crying. She looked at the man, weathered, vulnerable, brave enough to bring his pain into the light. And she said, "I don't always know. That's the truth. But I've stopped needing to be sure before I speak. I show up anyway. I whisper anyway. I believe again, not because everything's okay, but because I've seen what happens when we let ourselves be seen. The man nodded, his eyes wet. "That's enough," he said quietly. "That's enough for now." And Jasmine knew. That was faith, not certainty, not a clean answer, but a seed in the soil. That night, on her way out of the building, a little boy handed her a drawing, a stick figure of her again, a microphone, a heart in the sky this time, instead of a sun. "My sister Alora said to tell you hi," he whispered. "She said she thinks God listens to your voice now." Jasmine blinked back sudden tears. "Tell her I hear hers too," she said. She got in her car, drove under the stars, and somewhere in the silence between mile markers, she began to pray. Not out loud, not with perfect words, but with the fullness of someone who had learned that broken faith is still faith, that showing up with questions is still worship, that when a child asks you what God means, the truest answer isn't perfect theology, it's presence. It's the willingness to sit in the storm and believe that something sacred might still be born from the wreckage. She whispered, "Thank you for sending her." And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in the dark. Months passed. The story faded from the news, but it didn't fade from the people who had been in the room that day, or from the hundreds who wrote to her, or from the churches that began printing her words beside scripture. It didn't fade from Alora, who kept asking questions and kept believing in small, brave ways. And it didn't fade from Jasmine, who now carried that child's drawing folded in her wallet next to her ID, like armor, like truth, like grace. She began opening her speeches not with slogans, but with silence. 10 seconds of stillness, to honor questions too big for politics. To remember that courage isn't always fire. It's often the quiet decision to speak gently, even when the world demands a roar. And at every town hall, she ended the same way. If you've ever stopped praying, but still kept walking, you're not alone. If your voice still shakes when you talk about faith, it means you haven't let it die. If you're waiting for a sign, sometimes it looks like a child with uneven braids holding a bent Bible asking what matters most. That's the voice of God too. Then she would pause, let it settle, let it breathe, and say, "Keep going." If this story stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Leave a comment. Tell us what faith means to you today. And if you still believe in quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout, subscribe for more stories that speak softly and change everything.